does having a porn addiction affect a healthy sex life? So I know we touched on it a bit, that sometimes maybe there isn't a sex life, or sometimes you're thinking about so many other people, but in what other ways does it affect your sex life?
Well, I think the amount of time it takes, to have a healthy sexual relationship, you've got to do an investment. So there's got to be communication, there's got to be presence, awareness. A porn addiction just takes you away. Some people spend hours and hours and hours investing, excuse me, even though they may not be on the internet or watching the porn, those images are going through their mind. Because they're driven by shame and guilt, they almost tend to avoid their partners. And if they're caught up in active addiction, they also transfer. So they blame their partners for a lot of not being available, not meeting their needs, not hearing. And we don't really know how much of that is the truth and how much of it is that of the addict who's saying, I don't know how to do this, but it's hard for me, so I'll just make you look at your stuff. But really, it's about just not being present in mind, body, or soul.
Martin, how were you able to overcome, as you mentioned, sometimes there's 15 different images running through your head when you're having sex with your wife. How were you able to overcome that and actually enter into a healthy sexual relationship?
Well, for me, there's a couple of things to look at the whole process. It's in my specific case, the porn addiction stemmed from my abuse. It stemmed from the fact that I was sexually abused. So and that is a given. That's a definite fact. The fact that I was abused made me look for relationships elsewhere. So I needed to start with the abuse. I needed to start dealing with that. The shame of it, the blame of it, all the myths that surround abuse for men. The fact that if you were abused, you probably play, you enjoyed it. The myths of if you were abused sexually, you probably go on to be a pedophile yourself. And these are all myths. And, these things, it's a totally different show. I'm sure we could do a whole thing on that. For instance, my daughter, I didn't touch my daughter for 7 years because of these myths. The first 7 years of her life, I wasn't really involved with her because I was so afraid that I was a pedophile. In my heart, I knew that I'd never hurt a child, but in my head, it kept telling me, there's something wrong with you. It's the vampire myth, So I needed to deal with the abuse to start with. That was my first stage, and I had to face that head on. Then to deal with the porn addiction is to firstly acknowledge that it is an addiction, that it is a problem, that it is kind of taking over your life. The same as it would be with drugs, with alcohol, with anything like that. Porn is exactly the same. In fact, in studies that they're doing now, they're finding that your mind starts releasing endorphins. The more porn you use, you get all these feel-good chemicals that are released into your brain, and the effect is the same as drinking, the same as taking drugs and that sort of stuff, and it's very, very similar. And as Cheryl pointed out earlier, it's a progressive disease. So the more you use, the more you need to do, and the more dark it gets, the more evil, the more risque it gets. And you start off with innocently, and you eventually end up with grannies in bondage and all sorts of nonsense, just to titillate yourself and to make it feel like something's happening. You need, and that would be the same with heroin. You start off with 1 hit today, then you need 2 tomorrow, and 5 by the end of the week, and so on and so forth, just to keep getting that same feeling. So yeah, honesty, facing the fact that it was definitely an addiction, and facing and being real about myself. I'd been through alcohol recovery, and I'd helped out in a couple of AA groups and run a few of them. So I kind of knew the 12-step program, and I'd really worked it through in my life, and that I used those same principles in the porn addiction. And it is after sort of 3 or 4 months of recovery that your mind actually starts getting back to normality, where you can actually start thinking reasonably normally, and that you can actually start dealing with life on life's terms. And that was when I started learning to connect emotionally with people.